The crash cart was already rolling down the hallway when Sergeant Major Ellison Hayes threw his breakfast tray at the wall. The scrambled eggs hit the painted cinder block at 0712 and slid down in a slow, ugly streak. The orange juice followed a half-second later, shattering the plastic cup against the doorframe. Nurse Doreen Capshaw stumbled backward into the hallway, her hand pressed flat against her chest, her face the color of old chalk. "Get someone who actually knows how to take a blood pressure reading," Hayes bellowed from inside room 318. His voice had the kind of velocity that didn't come from yelling. It came from 30 years of making men move. "I asked for a cuff, not a conversation. Get out of my room." Dr. Leonard Marsh appeared at the nurse's station at a near jog, stethoscope swinging, reading the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen this particular flavor of catastrophe before. He pulled Hayes's chart from the slot without being asked. "What happened?" he asked, though his eyes were already scanning the admission notes. Doreen pressed her lips together. "He said I was incompetent. He said the Army trained better medics than whatever I learned in nursing school. And then he said..." She stopped. Her chin wobbled once before she locked it down. "He said I had no business touching a man who had actually seen something in his life." Marsh closed his eyes briefly. "His creatinine is climbing. If we don't get a nephrology consult started in the next 2 hours, then someone needs to go back in there." Doreen said it flatly. She was not volunteering. The break room was just off the station, separated by a frosted glass partition. Inside it, Nurse Petra Sokolova was eating a granola bar over the sink. She was 31 years old, with close-cropped dark hair she kept pinned behind her ears, and the particular stillness of a person who had learned, through some long and specific education, not to waste movement. She had heard every word. She finished the granola bar, folded the wrapper precisely in half, dropped it in the trash, and walked to the station. She held out her hand for the chart. Marsh looked at her for a moment. "He's requesting a male nurse, or a doctor. Preferably both, I heard." Petra, the chart. She did not open it immediately. She stood at the counter and paged through it with the same deliberate focus she brought to everything, not hurrying, not stalling. Her eyes moved through the vitals, the lab results, the medication reconciliation. Then they reached the social history section, and something shifted in her expression. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happened in a face trained not to show things. A slight compression around the eyes. A breath drawn a half count slower than the one before it. She set the chart down on the counter. "Draw up 40 milligrams of furosemide," she said quietly, "and bring me a Foley kit. He's retaining." She prepared the medication tray with the same economy of motion she used for everything else. No wasted reach, no unnecessary equipment. Then she walked down the corridor toward room 318, her footsteps even on the linoleum, and pushed the door open without knocking. Hayes was sitting upright in the hospital bed, with the posture of a man who considered lying down a form of surrender. He was 64 years old and built like something structural. Wide through the shoulders, thick through the neck, his gray hair cut so short it was almost stubble. An American flag tattoo covered most of his right forearm, faded to the particular blue-green of old military ink, and his wrists bore the corded, knotted look of someone who had loaded and carried heavy things for the better part of 4 decades. A deteriorating left kidney, an early-stage congestive heart failure, had put him in the San Antonio Military Medical Center for the 4th time in 18 months, but the disease had not yet found the part of him that produced contempt. That part appeared to be in excellent health. He didn't look at her when she entered. "I said I wanted someone else," he announced to the window. "Good morning, Sergeant Major," Petra said. She set the medication tray on the overbed table and moved to the IV pole without asking permission. Now he looked at her. His eyes were a pale, sharp gray, and the assessment he ran on her was the kind that happened in the first 3 seconds and did not soften afterward. "You deaf or just stupid?" he said. "Neither," Petra said. "Your potassium is 5.8. Your legs are retaining approximately 4 liters of fluid. Your heart is working about 40% harder than it should be because your kidneys are failing to pull their weight. We're going to fix that this morning." She picked up the tubing. "I need your left arm." "You need to listen," Hayes said. The volume dropped, which made it worse. That was the trick. The quiet ones were the ones who had learned they didn't have to shout. "I have been in this hospital system for a year and a half. I have been poked, prodded, and scheduled by people who couldn't find a vein with a map and a flashlight. I have had interns explain my own body to me like I'm a man who never read a medical field manual. I have sat in waiting rooms for 6 hours to be told something I already knew." He turned back to the window. "I am not doing it anymore. Get me Dr. Marsh or get me out." Petra did not stop what she was doing. "You commanded the 75th Ranger Regiment's 2nd Battalion," she said. The silence was immediate and total. Hayes turned his head back toward her, slowly. "Kandahar Province," Petra continued. She was hanging the IV bag, not looking at him. "2 deployments as battalion commander, 2008 and 2011. Before that, B Company, 1st Battalion, 75th Rangers. Mosul, 2004, Fort Benning before that. You were a ranger instructor for 2 years between deployments. You trained selection candidates." She looked at him then. Her voice had not changed at all in temperature or pace. "You received the Silver Star in 2004 and declined to discuss it in the official after-action documentation." Hayes's expression had gone somewhere difficult to read. "How do you know that?" he said. Petra didn't answer immediately. She checked the drip rate on the IV, adjusted it by 2 milliliters, and then set the tubing back in place. Then she reached up to the collar of her scrub top and unclipped her hospital badge, setting it on the overbed table next to the medication tray. She reached for the hem of her left sleeve. She pushed the fabric up to the elbow. On the inside of her left forearm, running from just below the crook of her elbow down toward her wrist, was a tattoo. It was not decorative. It had no shading, no flourish. It was the kind of tattoo a person got for themselves, not for anyone else. A ranger scroll in stark black lettering arched above a single set of coordinates. Below the coordinates, in smaller print, Mosul, the 19th April 2004. Hayes went very still. "I was a 68 whiskey," Petra said. She pulled her sleeve back down. "Combat medic. Attached to B Company, 1st Battalion, in 2004. She picked up the chart again and turned to the medication page. "I was 20 years old. You were a captain." He stared at her. "You were." He stopped. His voice had lost something. Not the hardness, exactly. Something under the hardness. Sokolova. Petraka Sokolova. "Petra," she said. He exhaled through his nose. Something passed across his face that was not quite. Emotion, more like the memory of emotion, recalled from a significant distance. "You were the medic on the April 19th patrol." "Yes." "I thought you left the army." "I did. I went to nursing school. I've been here 4 years. She set the chart down. "Now your left arm, Sergeant Major." "I'm not going to ask again." A long pause stretched between them. Hayes looked at the tattoo on his own forearm, then at the place on her arm where her sleeve now lay flat and smooth over the ink. Then, with the slow, deliberate movement of a man making a decision he had not anticipated, he extended his left arm across the bed rail. Petra worked in silence, finding the vein in 2 seconds, threading the catheter cleanly. She flushed the line, connected the medication, and taped everything down with 4 strips of surgical tape at precise angles. "You should feel the diuretic working within about 20 minutes, she said. "The urinary catheter will need to go in next. I'll have another nurse assist." She stripped off her gloves. "Doreen Capshaw is one of the best nurses on this floor. She has been doing this for 11 years, and she takes excellent care of her patients. She does not deserve to have her breakfast thrown at her." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "she doesn't." It was the smallest possible concession. Petra took it. She turned to go. "How much of it do you remember?" Hayes asked behind her. She stopped with her hand on the door. She did not turn around. "All of it," she said. She walked out. The afternoon light came through the window of room 318, at a low angle, catching the dust in the air and laying long yellow stripes across the floor. Hayes's fluid numbers were improving, which meant his irritability was, paradoxically, getting worse. When people felt better, Petra had learned, they found more energy to resist being treated. She was rechecking his vitals at 1400 when he started talking again. Not at her, exactly. More into the space above the bed. "The 5.8 potassium," he said. "That's been climbing for 6 weeks." "Yes," Petra said. "The VA flagged it twice. I sat in the waiting room both times. They told me to reduce my salt intake, AA. The VA is understaffed by approximately 30% across the region," Petra said. "That doesn't make it acceptable. It makes it a fact. Men I served with can't get an appointment for 3 months, Hayes said. Good men. Men who left parts of themselves overseas and came back to this." He gestured with his good arm at the institutional walls, the water-stained ceiling tile, the beige monotony of a system that was trying and failing. They sit in parking lots in their trucks, and they wait, and they get worse, and they don't say anything because they spent 20 years being told not to need things. His voice had developed an edge that was different from the morning edge. Less cutting, more raw. And meanwhile, I'm in here throwing orange juice because a nurse made me wait 8 minutes for a blood pressure cuff. He stopped. Petra said nothing. She wrote the blood pressure reading in the chart. "That's the thing about this place," Hayes said quietly. "It makes me into someone I don't like." "Hospitals do that," Petra said, "especially to people who are accustomed to being in control of their own environment. The body stops cooperating, and there's nothing to fight. So you fight the nearest available target. Psychology degree?" he said. "No, just 11 years of watching it happen." He looked at her for a long moment. "How old are you?" 31. He seemed to do a calculation. "You were barely out of AIT when you came to Mosul. 21 by the time we got there. My birthday was in March. We deployed in February." She closed the chart. "I had been practicing IVs on oranges for 2 months. My hands were good. My experience was nothing." "Your hands were better than nothing," Hayes said. "They were considerably better than nothing." Petra looked at him directly. There was something in his face now that had not been there in the morning. Not softened, exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door opens when someone stops leaning against it from the other side. "What happened to Richter?" he asked. The name came out carefully, like he had been holding it. Petra was quiet for 3 seconds. "He finished his contract," she said. "Went back to Idaho. He's a foreman on a logging crew. He has 2 kids. And Delacroix?" I don't know. We lost touch after 2006. Hayes nodded slowly. He was looking at the window again. The afternoon light was getting longer, getting redder, beginning its slow exit. April 19th, he said. You don't have to. I've been over it 10,000 times, he said. Probably 10,001 before the week is out. The route was flagged. We had a report from the day before that the western approach to Grid 438 had been used by a courier network, the kind that moved more than messages. I ran it up the chain. I was told the intel was not actionable, that the eastern approach was the primary threat axis, that I was overthinking it. He paused. I sent 12 men down that western approach anyway, because I thought the eastern report was wrong. And at 11:47, the third vehicle hit a command wire IED buried in the roadbed under 2 feet of packed gravel. The monitoring equipment beeped its steady rhythm. Outside in the hallway, someone was wheeling a cart, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary hospital afternoon. 3 men went to Landstuhl, Hayes said. Corporal Eddie Briggs died on the table at the CSH before he ever got on a plane. He was 22 years old. He had a wife in Savannah named Teresa and a daughter he had never met. The daughter was born while he was at Landstuhl in a coma. He swallowed. I wrote the letter. I have written a lot of letters. That one took me 4 days and I still don't think I got it right. Petra was no longer charting. She was standing at the foot of his bed, her hands at her sides, watching him. I have been telling myself for 19 years, Hayes said, that I made the wrong call. That if I had listened to the chain of command, if I had routed the patrol east the way I was told, Eddie Briggs would be 51 years old, and his daughter would know who her father was. He stopped. That's the one I can't put down. That's the one I can't. His voice caught for just a moment, a single break in the stone. He wrote it out. That's why I'm in here, throwing breakfast trays. Because what's the alternative? What's the other option? Petra pulled the rolling stool from the corner. She sat down at his level, her elbows on her knees. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it the whole way through before you say anything. Hayes looked at her. His jaw was set, but his eyes were open. On April 19th, I was in the second vehicle, Petra said. When the third vehicle hit, we dismounted and pushed forward on foot. I was running to Briggs before the smoke cleared. I know what you're about to say, that I'm going to tell you it wasn't your fault, that I'm going to offer you something to make you feel better. I'm not. Hayes said nothing. The command wire IED on the western approach was real, Petra said. You were right about the eastern report. The eastern approach was clean. If you had routed east, the patrol would have returned without incident. She let that sit for a moment, and the cell that had been using the western approach would have moved their supply line north that same afternoon. We learned that 6 weeks later from an informant network. The entire network, weapons cache, personnel, financing, would have been out of the province within 72 hours. Hayes frowned slightly. That's not in anything I was given after the fact, because it was compartmentalized at the division level until 2017, Petra said. It was part of a longer intelligence thread about a financing network that had tentacles into 4 provinces. Division didn't want it surfaced. They sealed the after-action analysis from the battalion level. Where did you get this? I have been in this system for 4 years, Petra said. I take care of a lot of veterans. A few years ago, I was taking care of a retired intelligence officer who had been stationed at division headquarters in 2004. He remembered April 19th because the IED report intersected with his network thread. He told me about the SEAL. She paused. He also told me that the patrol, your patrol, had moved through the western approach rather than north. That the cell had actually displaced faster than projected because of your patrol's movement. That the weapons cache that would have gone north was recovered by a different element 6 weeks later because the cell had to move it in a hurry and left a trail. The monitoring equipment beeped. Eddie Briggs is dead, Petra said. She did not soften it. That happened. That is real. I am not going to tell you that it doesn't count, or that it shouldn't hurt. She leaned forward slightly. But the call you made on April 19th disrupted an active weapons distribution network that was supplying IED components to cells across 4 provinces. The recovery 6 weeks later led directly to the neutralization of a manufacturing site outside Tikrit. The analysis from that site contributed to another operation in 2005. She looked at him steadily. You were not wrong about the Eastern report, and the cost of being right was not wasted. The room was very quiet. Hayes's hands were resting on the blanket, palm up, the way hands fall when they have stopped holding something. He was staring at a point above the window. His face was doing something complicated and private that Petra did not look away from, because she had learned that looking away was its own form of cowardice. That doesn't bring him back, Hayes said. His voice was very low. No, Petra said, it doesn't. Theresa Briggs is a widow. That little girl grew up without a father. That's real. Yes. And I'm supposed to, what? Feel better? No, Petra said. You're not supposed to feel anything in particular. You lost a soldier. You're allowed to carry that. But you have been carrying the wrong part of it for 19 years. She let that land. You have been carrying the guilt of a bad decision. That's not what happened. What happened is that you made a correct tactical assessment. You were overruled. You held your position anyway. And 12 men paid a real price for a real result. That is a different kind of weight. It doesn't go away. But it's the right weight. Hayes looked at her for a long time without speaking. When he finally did speak, his voice had gone somewhere Petra hadn't heard from him before. Not soft, exactly, but reduced somehow to something more essential. Petraka, he said. The old name, the name the guys in B Company had used. Half teasing, half affectionate. The kind of nickname that only lives in a specific time and place. Why are you still doing this? You could have. You were good enough. You had the training. You could have gone to PA school, med school. Why are you still? He gestured at the room, at the IV pole, at the fluorescent lights. Why are you still here, doing this? Petra was quiet for a moment. Because the men I served with don't disappear when they come home, she said. They end up in places like this. And this is where I know how to help. Hayes closed his eyes. One slow exhale, long and controlled, the kind of breath that takes practice. I owe Doreen Capshaw an apology, he said. Yes, Petra said. You do. I'll take care of it. I know you will. She stood, retrieved the chart, and made her notation. At the door, she paused. You asked me this morning how I knew about your record, she said. Hayes opened his eyes. When I take a new patient, Petra said, I always read the military service section first. Most nurses skip it. I don't. She looked at him steadily. Because it tells me who they were before they were sick. And that matters. She went out. Hayes was in the SAMC for 11 more days. By the 3rd day, his potassium had normalized. By the 5th, the fluid retention had resolved enough that he could walk the hallway without the auxiliary oxygen. By the 8th, the nephrology team had adjusted his medication regimen to the point where, barring further deterioration, he might stabilize at his current kidney function for another 2 years. He followed every instruction Petra gave him without argument. He was, the charge nurse observed to Dr. Marsh, a completely different patient. Thorough, cooperative, meticulous about his fluid logs, doing his physical therapy exercises with a focus that bordered on aggressive. He also, on the morning of day 3, asked Doreen Capshaw to come to his room. He had obtained, through means that remained unclear, a small arrangement of yellow tulips from the hospital gift shop. He placed them on her side of the table before she arrived. He apologized without qualification, without explaining himself, and without asking for anything in return. Doreen cried a little. Hayes pretended not to notice. On the morning of his discharge, Petra was finishing rounds when the charge nurse appeared in the hallway. "They're asking for you at the front," she said. "The whole lobby." Petra frowned. She pulled off her gloves and walked toward the elevator. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby level, she heard them before she saw them. Not voices, the sounds were quieter than that. The particular quality of a space that has become very still because many people have chosen at the same moment to stop moving. She rounded the corner and stopped. Ellison Hayes was standing near the main entrance, out of the wheelchair he had arrived in civilian clothes, dark jacket, pressed slacks, a Ranger Regiment veteran's cap worn at a precise angle. His discharge paperwork was folded in the breast pocket of his jacket. He was standing because he had decided to stand, and his kidneys and his heart and the better part of his remaining pride had allowed it. Behind him were 9 men. They wore civilian clothes, flannels, work jackets, one leather vest, but they stood the way men stand who have spent years being asked to account for the space their bodies occupy. Several had visible scars. One was missing 2 fingers on his right hand. One walked with a pronounced limp and a cane he handled with the casualness of long familiarity. They ranged in age from what looked like late 20s to somewhere past 60. Petra recognized 3 of them. The one with the cane was Sergeant, First Class Roy Harbour, who had been with 3rd Platoon and had taken shrapnel in both legs at the same IED that killed Briggs. He had lost 3 toes and most of the feeling in his left foot, and he had gone home to a ranch in Montana and raised cattle for 14 years. Beside him, thinner than she remembered, was Tommy Weck, who had been the driver of the 2nd vehicle on April 19th, who had pulled Petra out of the ditch by her vest when the blast wave knocked her sideways, who had once eaten an entire MRE in under 45 seconds on a bet and been deeply proud of it. And behind them both, standing very straight, was a woman Petra did not immediately recognize. Older, in her 50s, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and a set to her jaw that was specific and unmistakable. She was holding a small item in both hands. Hayes stepped forward. "When I went back to the unit after Landstuhl," he said, his voice carrying cleanly in the quiet lobby, "the first thing I did was look up every man and woman who had been on that patrol. I tracked them for years. Some of them I found, some of them I didn't." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't find you until 3 months ago, when my case was transferred here, and your name was in the care team notes." He nodded to the woman with the silver-streaked hair. "This is Teresa Briggs," he said. The lobby had gone completely still. Somewhere behind the admissions desk, someone had stopped typing. "Teresa reached out to me in 2022, Hayes said. "She had been doing her own research. She found some of the same documentation you found. Different pathway, different source. She spent 4 years trying to get to a complete picture of what happened that day." He paused. "She wanted to find the people who were there." Teresa Briggs stepped forward. She extended her hands. Petra looked down. Resting in the woman's palms was a photograph, printed on paper that had the weight and slight sheen of something preserved, something that had been in a frame for many years. It showed a group of soldiers outside a forward operating base, squinting into desert sun, half of them not quite ready for the camera. One of them, dark-haired and 20 years old, was looking directly at the lens. Another, taller, with his arm around two other soldiers, was caught mid-law, on the back, in careful handwriting. B Company, 1st Bean, 75th RGR. Mosul, 2004. Eddie, 2nd, from left. His daughter is 21 years old, Teresa said. Her voice was quiet and did not waver. Her name is Charlotte. She wanted to know who was there with him, who knew him. She swallowed once. I told her about you. About the medic. She wanted you to have this. Petra took the photograph. Her hands were steady. Her face was not. Around her, in a single unhurried movement, the 9 men behind Hayes came to attention. Roy Harbour straightened despite his cane. Tommy Weck squared his shoulders. The man with the missing fingers pressed his remaining ones flat to his thigh. They came to attention, not to rank, not to protocol, not to any hierarchy that the United States military had ever formally codified, but to something older than all of that, the specific recognition of one person by the people who had stood in the same dirt and still carried the same coordinates somewhere in the architecture of themselves. Hayes raised his right hand in a salute. The others followed one by one until all 9 hands were raised in the fluorescent light of the hospital lobby. Petra stood there for a moment with the photograph against her chest, the image of a young man who had been 22 years old in a desert 19 years ago, who had a wife in Savannah and a daughter he never held, who had not died because of a bad order, but because of a good one, who had mattered to the person holding this picture, and the people standing in this room, and the woman across from them who had been the last person to be close enough to matter. She raised her hand. The salute she returned was the same one she had learned at 20 years old in a cramped training ream room at Fort Benning. Clean, precise, held for the full count of 3. Then Hayes dropped his hand, and the others followed. The lobby returned slowly to itself. On her way back to the elevator, Petra stopped at the admissions desk and asked for an envelope. She slid the photograph inside and wrote on the front, "For Charlotte." Then she went back upstairs to finish her shift.